What is going on YouTube? Bryce Builds It All, your favorite A&P IA, and Part 147 instructor here. And today I am standing in front of a 1949 Cessna 140A. It's actually a 1950, but it was built in December of 1949, so I guess technically it's a 1949, I don't know. Anyways, this video is about you wanting to own, or should I say, is it a good idea? Is it right for you to own a vintage or a classic aircraft? If that's something that interests you, as always, stick around. I would like to start this video by giving you kind of a couple of facts, if you will, about classic aircraft and what I mean when I say classic or vintage aircraft. And really what I mean by that is airplanes that are older than about 1965-ish. They can be newer than 1965, of course, but I mean aircraft that are no longer in production and typically no longer supported by their manufacturer, either because the manufacturer is out of business or just because the aircraft hasn't been produced in so long. And this Cessna 140 would be an example of that. Cessna moved on and built the Cessna 150 and then the Cessna 152, and then even the Cessna 152 went out of production. So this is no longer an aircraft that's in production. It's no longer an aircraft that Cessna makes. Cessna still makes the 172 and they still make the 206, but they don't make the 140 anymore. Now the earlier 140s, if you're not familiar with the 120 and the 140, the 120 and 140 are both a fabric wing, the difference being that a 120 does not have flaps and a 140 does. And then when they made the 140A, they ended up doing a metal wing that looks a lot like a Cessna 150's wing, except the 140A, the flaps are not Fowler flaps, they just drop straight down. You may or may not find that interesting. But anyways, so there's lots of aircraft that were built like this. You have Loscombs, you have Malls, you have Taylorcraft, you have Aranca Champs, just to name a few. The list goes on and on and on and on. But something that's very common with a lot of these older aircraft that you're gonna have to understand if you wanna own one is they're not very well supported anymore. A lot of times there is no maintenance manual, or the maintenance manuals for them suck. And by I mean the maintenance manuals for them suck. They say, remove wheel assembly. Installation is opposite of removal. And you're like, that doesn't help. So you have to understand that the manuals and things for these aircraft are not very good. They were produced a long time ago, so they are aging, parts are beginning to wear out, and these are all kinds of things that you're gonna have to deal with when you own one. Also, because they are so old, they've had a lot of years to be modified, and they often are modified with things like Cleveland wheels and brakes, which in my opinion is an upgrade because those parts are still supported, as opposed to the old Goodyear style brakes are not as much supported. So they have been upgraded with lots of different STCs a lot of the times. If they're fabric, usually the fabric has been changed from grade A cotton to some sort of modern fiber. And you need to understand that when you buy one of these, you need someone, you need an IA, you need a mechanic who works on them a lot or specializes them, and I'll put that in quotes, specializes in those aircraft, to take a little bit better look at it, because they'll know what mods it has, what mods it needs, what things have been done to it, if the paperwork has been done right for it, because you're dealing with an airplane, in the case of this one being from 1950, you're dealing with an airplane that's 74 years old. It's probably had a lot of things done to it. At one point, this thing was painted black, and nobody knows what paint it is. At first, I thought it was lacquer, but the owner tells me that no, it's not lacquer, because lacquer thinner won't do anything to it. You can rub lacquer thinner on it all day. And he thinks that it was actually painted with some form of epoxy. Now, I was absolutely shocked to find out that this airplane was stripped and painted in 1968. And the paint on it still looks really, really good. But again, that's one of those things to consider, is that some of these aircraft have been restored, some of them have not. If you are considering buying one to restore, you need to make sure that you either are an A&P or you are talking to an A&P IA regularly as you go through the process of restoring the aircraft, because this is not something that you can just buy and rebuild in your garage like a car. I have helped a few people restore vintage aircraft like this. I will say some are easier, like Aranca Champs 7ACs, because American Champion still owns the TCDS for them, and they are the same / share a lot of parts with the Decathlon and the DMC-12 and some of those other modern airframes. So you can still get wood for it. You can still get those kinds of things for it. But all things to consider. Also, on top of that, you're not going to have modern radios in them unless the aircraft has been modified at some point. And if it has been modified, it's probably had 2 or 3 different radio stacks in it at this point. It's not like buying a brand new Cessna that has a Garmin 1000 system already in it and it's already ready to go. It's probably been modified a couple of times. It's probably had a couple different radios in there, which means there can be wires and things left behind that are just a little bit more of a headache when they go into maintenance. However, the benefit of these aircraft is they're usually very simple. They're usually very, cheap. They're usually very easy to work on. This was before Cessna started hiding things in panels way over here. When the panel is over here, it was a whole thing, but it's besides the point. So if you buy one of these aircraft, they are actually a little bit easier to work on. They're more simple. In my opinion, they're somewhat robust. They've stood the test of time. They've proven for 70 years that it is a reliable airframe. And any problems, any of your typical issues at this point have either been ironed out or identified by the owners clubs for these aircraft. And what you'll find is that the owners of these vintage aircraft are some of the nicest, greatest people, but they have communities devoted to these aircraft and sharing information and talking about them and owning them and loving them. So if you own a vintage aircraft like that, you know what I'm talking about, feel free to drop that in the comments because I know some people aren't going to believe me. Now, the last thing I will talk about, and I am not a pilot, I am a mechanic, but the last thing I will talk about is operating one of these aircraft on a daily basis. This is not necessarily the aircraft you want to buy / own if you are going to be commuting in it regularly or if you're going to be taking it on business trips regularly. Something like a Mooney M20J or a modern 182 is going to do a lot better job of that than, say, an old 140, an old 170, even an old 180, which is a great bush plane. But this aircraft is not going to do as well flying into controlled airspace, Class A, Class B, that kind of thing, just because it's not equipped for it. It was never designed for it. If it does have that equipment, it's been modified to have that equipment, and yes, it'll still work. Yes, you can still do it, but it's a bit like riding a vintage motorcycle when you could buy a brand new Honda CBR. Like, why would you buy the vintage motorcycle and try to make it work? So if this is something that you're going to be using as anything more than just a toy, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. Now, interestingly enough, the owner of this aircraft has owned it for 40 years, and he is a CFI, and he uses this aircraft for his tailwheel training. So there is still value in owning one, in my opinion, and there are still things that they are very good at that other aircraft will not do. For example, the Cessna 180, which I haven't talked about ever on my channel and probably need to make a video on because it's one of my favorite aircraft, is a very robust, very powerful bush aircraft that has been a very popular bush aircraft for years and years and years and years. And for that reason, they stay very expensive and they stay very, very loved. But they do that very well, and that's why people use them for that so often. So there you go, everybody. If this video interests you, if you liked it, make sure you leave me a like, leave me a comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. As always, I ask that you follow me on Instagram, join the Discord, and as always, go build something and be easy.